This episode is brought to you by Progressive, home of the Name Your Price tool. You say how much you want to pay for car insurance, and they'll show you coverage options that fit your budget. It's easy to start a quote. Visit Progressive.com to get started. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, summer of 1934, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt has signed the Indian Reorganization Act, the IRA, the centerpiece of what is often called the Indian New Deal. This was part of FDR's larger New Deal economic policies. Tens of thousands of Native Americans found work as part of FDR's economic development programs. FDR would say, quote, "We can and should without further delay extend to the Indian the fundamental rights of political liberty and local self-government and the opportunities of education and economic assistance that they require in order to attain a wholesome American life." And so you can hear in that quote not just economic policies, but also this idea of political liberty and local self-government and opportunity. So this era and this IRA, this Indian New Deal, signaled a larger shift in how the U.S. saw Native peoples, both as a political entity and, for lack of a better way of putting it, kind of in the public imagination. We'll get into it, but the man in charge of putting these policies into effect, John Collier, kind of saw himself as an advocate and sort of a paternalistic defender of Native culture, especially in comparison to what he saw as modern, corrupt American ways. And throughout the 20th century, that idea of Indian identity has been often romanticized and corrupted and contested and messy and controversial. And our two guests today are two people who have thought a lot about this. They are the co-hosts of a new series from Canada Land called The Pretendians, which is a look at the long history of people who have claimed Indigenous identity who aren't necessarily always actually Indigenous. So Robert Jago is a writer and activist from Richmond, BC, a citizen of both the Kwantlen First Nation and Nuksuck Indian tribe. And Angel Ellis is the co-host of Pretendians. She's the director of Muskogee Media and an activist for independent media within the Muskogee Creek Nation. Robert, Angel, thank you so much for joining us. This is a really fascinating topic and brilliant series, so congratulations.
Thanks very much.
Thank you for having us.
And here, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
So, Robert, Angel, your series, as I said, focuses on what you call Pretendians. But as I mentioned, it is about this larger, messier question of identity and how white people and white government has viewed Indigenous people and Indigenous government. So, I want to get to some of those stories, but can you tie it into this IRA, this Indian New Deal era, and I guess this larger era of what's happening in the 30s about how, from both a policy and public imagination perspective, we are thinking about Native peoples?
Yeah, I mean, first off, this IRA era, what it really was a gift-wrapped thing. We're going to give you this only if you start governing yourselves the way we see fit. This approved way of government, this Western idea of governance. And I say it's a Western idea because long before the United States existed, my tribe had a tricambrial government and a council and ways of governing themselves. And it was a very peaceful structure. We were one of the largest confederacies of tribes in the world, in the Americas anyway. There was 34 different tribes in our confederacy, and we took up much of the South. But when the removal era happened, they get rid of those things. And they send people to reservations. And then, here comes the 1930s. And after 50 years of extraction, they say, hey, we'll give you something back if you play ball our way. And so it ended a lot of our really traditional governance practices. And I think that's one of the things that's often missed on the surface level of looking at the Indian Reorganization Act, that it actually undid tribal self-governance the way tribes had been doing it.
Yeah, there's something in that quote that you read at the beginning, Jody, about from Franklin Roosevelt, where he's appealing to all of these high-sounding ideas of political liberty, local self-government. But that quote ended with, in order to attain a wholesome American life. And that was packed with so many assumptions about what the good life, what a proper American life looked like. And so in many ways, saying we want you to have local self-government meant giving up your local self-government, which is what's so pernicious about some of these framings.
But like, it was really an excuse to set up the leadership in tribes that the federal government wanted to work with.
Yeah.
And so in this era, we see many tribes lose self-governance and they lose the ability to elect their own leaders. And that absolutely is destructive to the indigenous culture.
Another part of the IRA is that it forced tribes to solidify and, in many cases, ossify their rules for who is a tribal member. We had blood quantum develop at the end of the previous century with the Dawes Act, but now it becomes the law of the land in almost every single tribe. And maybe I should explain what blood quantum is. I'm not sure if that's a really known term.
Yeah, please.
Blood quantum is the pedigree that every Native person has. Often it's on your identity card, and it says, what percentage of pure Native blood do you have? And you need to have this in order to access any number of public services from the federal government. You need to have it, in many cases, to vote on your tribe. You need to have it to cross the border and have working rights. There's all sorts of ways that this pedigree that's been imposed on us is applied, and that replaces the old way of membership, and that removes them from traditional forms of citizenship and identity, and that is at the root of a lot of the problems we see today.
It very much contributes to a lot of the confusion of identity that we experience today, many years out, and how, we're still struggling to overcome those federal government implications of what makes you Indian.
And it sows the seeds in that country to create this huge pool of disconnected people to whom a lot of grifters and opportunists and fantasists can attach themselves. And from that, you get the phenomenon of pretendianism.
This is so fascinating because I think in the past, at least several years, at least decade, we've seen so many of these like high profile instances of people claiming Indian identity that have no Indian identity whatsoever. But there is this sort of like cultural cachet by being able to like claim to these identities, and also as a sort of backlash, you've also seen like people that have been like, actually, no, you're not. And it's a phenomenon that's, I don't know, do you guys remember was it 2020 or maybe 2019 where a couple people had lost their jobs because it was like, actually, you're not Latino, actually, you're not Black, actually, you're not Native American, like had
the
been,
Rachel Dolezal era.
Yes.
We talk about it.
Of playing into these, identities, not having verification and not really being questioned about their identities either.
Yeah, and like the outside world doesn't really know how to verify an Indigenous person. How do you vet an Indigenous person? And it's very much a mystery outside of the Native community on how that's done. And I think that just kind of revisiting the IRA era, it came right after a really terrible era where Native children were taken from homes and put into boarding schools, and they were forcefully, stolen from their culture. And then the federal government goes, shit, we fucked y'all up real good. Now let's just give this all back to you to sort out. Yeah. And so many of those boarding schools came under tribal controls, and they're left with this almost cultural genocide of a generation of how do you even get those children back? And the answer is almost always no. Like not many of those people come back to who they, used to be. Like I have ancestors who just never spoke the language again. I'm like the first one in my family to have done it in a couple hundred years, learning to do it anyway. I'm not fluent, but those kind of things are lost. And so when the IRA comes around, this new era, it's kind of like, oh, change everything you do about yourselves to fit our model, and then you can sort out your own damn problems, is kind of how it really looked. It was packaged prettier on paper, but it left this huge void of people, trying to figure out who the hell they are and how to get by. And then during that allotment era, the federal government figured out really well how to fake this stuff. They were like, their land agents were ground zero people who knew exactly. They were letting people pay to be on the Dawes rolls. The Dawes rolls were a product of the, the allotment era. And they knew how to finagle that system because they knew that the allotments that they were giving out were very valuable land, and they wanted it to get into the hands of tax-paying citizens. And so they were letting people pay money to get on those rolls, and they were saying, hey, if we just put you on here and we just give you a little fraction blood quantum number, you'll be an insider in that tribe for the rest, for generations, literally. Some of them are now infiltrated the tribe for generations. Like the governor of Oklahoma is like a 200-year Pretendian. Like his family started in the 1880s as Pretendians, and now here he is in modern times, one of the most powerful Pretendians in the world. So shaping laws.
How do you untether that? Do you know what I mean? How do you divest someone from that inheritance and that's how the corruption is so systemic and so deep, because it's not just one person you're talking about, like as you said, generations, and that it gets messy very fast. Yes.
What's the one thing that most history books all over the world have in common? That they're seriously lacking in the melanin department. Wondery's podcast, Black History for Real, introduces you to the most overlooked Black history makers you should already know. Follow Black History for Real on the Wondery app or wherever you get your podcasts. You can listen to Black History for Real early and ad-free now by joining Wondery Plus. Discover more to the story with Wondery's other top history podcasts.
Shalom, dear listeners. This is Daniil Hartman.
And I'm Yossi Klein Halevi.
Together we host the podcast For Heaven's Sake from the Shalom Hartman Institute.
These have been some of the most challenging days for me personally, for Israel, and for the Jewish people. And one of the ways in which I've gotten through this is that I've found solace and meaning through discussions with my dear friend and study partner, Daniil Hartman.
And I hope that listeners will join us as we continue to tackle the pressing questions facing the Jewish people here at For Heaven's Sake, which has become the #1 Judaism podcast.
Tune into For Heaven's Sake at shalomhartman.org/For Heaven's Sake, or wherever you get your podcasts.
We've touched on a little bit of this, but I'm wondering, kind of over the course of your series, you obviously tell a lot of individual stories, but you paint a picture of the different eras in which this idea of Pretendianism has kind of jumped up and been a little more prominent. And to me, it roughly feels like, we've talked about it a little bit here, but it's like the 30s, the 70s, and a little more recently, are these kind of eras. And I wonder if you see those eras as reflective of a larger cultural anxiety, a larger cultural movement. I mean, I mentioned this guy, John Collier, in the 30s. I think he was very much kind of like anxious about, quote unquote, American modernity and looking to this romanticized notion of Native Americans. And that strikes me as something that was happening in the 70s too, and it's happening recently as well. And so I'm just wondering kind of what larger story about American culture and psychology you can paint through the rise of these Pretendian stories.
We've looked at these Pretendian stories going back to the 1800s, and it seems like there's 3 distinct eras. First off, there's the grifter era, which is, where you have the traveling medicine show, that kind of thing, where people play Indian to help sell their tonic, or to take advantage of tribes with a few dollars. It's like that episode of The Simpsons where there's the monorail guy, and every instance of Pretendians in that era are the monorail guy. The second era is more, and there's still a thread of the second era now, is that romantic notion that you're talking about of authenticity, as well as, the strange thing about racism against Native people is that in many cases, you look at racism and it's the in-group, it's white people saying Group X is inferior and we're better than them. Group Y is inferior and we're better than them. In many cases with Native people, they don't say that. They say their culture sucks. their culture is backwards, or their culture is just wild. But they don't say we're inferior. They say, we could be educated up and become regular citizens just like them. Because of that sort of feeling in the culture, there wasn't really as much of a stigma for people to claim some ties to us going back a long ways. And so in this big second era that probably leads up into the 30s and 40s, people are claiming white people are claiming native status in order to, have that rawness, that authenticity, that Americanness in them, as long as it's distant. And then I should add that Black people in that era are claiming native status because of things like the Racial Integrity Act, in order to
stay alive,
in order to escape oppression. There's a few different cases where, there's like famous performers who played Indian. They were a bit light skinned and they were able to play Indian and have like proper lives. And you even saw that in one of our stories. An Italian immigrant was being oppressed at that time and played Indian, very famously as the Cry Indian, in order to get away from the bigotry that he saw down in New Orleans. The third era is the modern one, where yes, there are the Pretendians on top of it all who are out for money, who are like the traveling medicine salesman again. But what's supporting it, like basically the roots of all of that, is what I've heard called a flight to innocence. As you have this like wokeness developing in the culture, there's just a lot of white people like saying, I feel it, but I wasn't there. It's like you said, I have a timestamp. See, like I have a pass. It wasn't me, because I'm, I look at those cheekbones of my great grandma. Obviously, I didn't do it.
Safe by cheekbones.
Oh man, the flight to innocence is real.
It is.
The flight to
it's really
innocence.
fascinating.
Absolutely.
And it's also, I grew up with this as well. It's like you hear these oral histories of people saying, yes, oh, your great grandmother was Native. Her hair was so long. You have all of these stories, unsubstantiated stories that feel good to the listener. Like, oh, we have this great past, this rich heritage, that I think tracks as well. I feel like if there's a fourth category, it would be like those who desire to have like a historical family line that they can point to. I know, at least in the Black experience, you can only go back so far. You know what I mean? You can't go back to the original OG African ancestor. And so by having these other pathways or narratives, it gives a sense of belonging that you couldn't lay claim to in other spaces.
I think that's a huge part of it too, because like we did an episode that was not like people out there doing major fraud. These were just like normal folks who just had a story. Every single one of them just really wanted to know where they came from. They just really wanted, like maybe they wanted to hand something down too, like right, like have a legacy of some sort, and like they were discovering some really heavy stuff, like by doing DNA. It's like, I think I'm Native. Oh shit, I don't know if my dad's my dad. That's
yes,
like literally, just these things are happening to people. In addition to the flight to innocence, though, there is a lot of people who are being failed by the American systems, and they're angry and they're upset and they feel betrayed. And when you see that shit that Hollywood puts on screen, right? Man, Native fits that, right? I feel like them. I really identify with this, right? Because Hollywood did this. Indians are the bad guys. Indians are noble savages, but, they have a reason to be the bad guys. A lot of Americans feel like that right now. They feel like they have a reason to be pissed off at the systems that they live under, whether it's capitalism, whether it's, failing democracy, these like electile dysfunction that we're living in. They feel like that outcasted kind of, this doesn't serve me. And so they kind of pick it up. Like, they like just put it on like the fringe jacket. Yeah. And roll around with it,
Well,
That fits.
I mean, shocker of shockers, the heart of all this is unresolved trauma. Basically every story, right? But yeah,
category.
Right. But at a personal level and I think at a societal level, as you've been describing. So look, I think we should, start to wrap up here because I want to leave space for people to go and listen to this incredible series. And here specifically, we didn't even get into some of the just sort of wild twists and turns and stories. We mostly stayed at the ideas level. But, on that note, any final specific examples from any of these eras that you keep coming back to that have stuck with you as you sort of went through this process of trying to understand this phenomenon?
The big thing for me was like when we put out our first episode, tribal nations were addressing the UN with this same problem. It's a big, big threat to tribal nations. And I just think that it's so important that people understand that. Right now, the tribal nations are crying out about self-identification and the harm that Pretendianism is causing them as an existential threat. I know that sounds like weird because we use some funny examples of it, and the tribal nations are really trying to find solutions to it.
Robert, final thoughts?
Final thoughts. Mm-hmm. So, right here in the 21st century, we've now had decades of us rebuilding after the Reorganization Act of the 1930s, after the Dawes Act of the 1880s, after the tribal disestablishment of the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And we're now in this moment of rebuilding and resurgence, which by coincidence, and solely by coincidence, is happening at the same time as this general awakening in the wider culture towards systemic injustices, towards, that long history of institutional racism. And because these two things are happening at the same time, we have this phenomena of pretendianism. And unfortunately, what may seem like positive, self-affirming beliefs, from the people who hold it about, re-embracing their culture and their identity is actually like acid to our nations and to our rebuilding structure. Because for everything that we develop and build for ourselves, somehow these people get to the front of the line and take it first. So, this moment we're in, where we have these two things that seem like they should be together, they're actually in harsh conflict, and that conflict has its roots in things like the IRA, in things like the Dawes and all that. And the solution is for regular people who feel like they have that sort of like mythical connection to think back to all of the other Americans who had romantic ideas like them and not. And just remember that all of these problems are caused by people much like them, who think like them and act like them. It's not just big government. It really begins with you.
Yeah. Great final note to end it on, and hopefully people will realize there's so much rich storytelling and just kind of jaw-dropping stuff in this series. The series is Pretendians. It's from Canada Land, 6 episodes, right? And it's all out now for you to binge or listen to how you wish. I'll also say, by the way, Robert and Angel, Canada Land, true independent media, like we have to support that. But I know both of you are also involved in other independent media and entities, and so it's really nice to see work this ambitious come from truly independent media. But Robert, Jago, Angel, Ellis, co-hosts of The Pretendians, thank you so much for doing this. This is truly fascinating.
Thank you very much.
Mado.
And Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.